My name is Nova. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady, not loud, not flashy, not the one who dominates a room the second she walks in. I work in a glossy tech company where the walls are glass, the snacks are free, and the beanbags are strategically placed to suggest creativity instead of competition. On the outside, my office looks like a recruitment video. Polished, youthful, progressive. But my office is a battle royale disguised as a workplace. Behind the free snacks and beanbags is a toxic culture where people literally sabotage each other to get a promotion. And for a long time, I was the woman everyone overlooked in the middle of it. I'm a senior operations analyst. That's the title, the surface role. The one that makes people nod politely and then immediately scan the room for someone more interesting. I'm not in sales, so I don't bring revenue applause. I'm not in marketing, so I'm not visible. I'm not an executive, so I don't sit at the long glass table on the 14th floor. I sit close enough to hear everything. People usually assume I'm agreeable, quiet, safe, the kind of person who will pick up the extra work if you frame it as a team effort, the kind who won't interrupt you in meetings, even when you rephrase her idea as your own. They're not entirely wrong, but what they misunderstand is this. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it's observation, sometimes it's calibration, sometimes it's the slow, deliberate gathering of weight. This story isn't about explosive revenge. There's no shouting match in a conference room, no dramatic resignation email sent at 2 a.m., no villain exposed with a single triumphant slideshow. It's about something quieter. It's about how subtle disrespect becomes culture, how culture becomes strategy, and how strategy, when left unchecked, eventually collapses under its own design. It's about the role I was assigned without my consent, reliable, invisible, replaceable, and the moment I realized I didn't have to accept it. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. The small cuts that didn't look like wounds, the meetings that changed tone when certain people walked in, the performance reviews felt scripted before they began, the day I stopped reacting and started choosing. I won't exaggerate, I won't dramatize, I won't pretend I was perfect or fearless. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I rationalized things that made me smaller. But I also learned something powerful about human behavior, especially in places that pretend to be collaborative while quietly rewarding cruelty. If you've ever worked somewhere that smiled at you while slowly pushing you toward the edges, if you've ever felt like competence made you useful but not valuable, then you might recognize parts of yourself in this. Tell me, have you ever realized too late that the culture everyone praised was quietly costing you something you couldn't see at first? In the beginning, I was solid. That was the word my manager used during my first annual review. Nova's solid, reliable, low maintenance. Low maintenance. It was meant as praise. In our office, where personalities clashed like competitive athletes pretending to collaborate, being low maintenance meant you weren't a problem. You didn't demand credit. You didn't escalate issues. You didn't make leadership uncomfortable. I smiled when he said it. What I didn't say was that I had stayed until 9 p.m. for 3 consecutive weeks to stabilize a reporting system that someone in product had quietly broken. What I didn't say was that the presentation our director praised in the all-hands meeting had been built from my framework, just delivered by someone more client-facing. But I told myself that's how it works. I was the infrastructure. Infrastructure isn't supposed to shine. The office itself was a performance. Glass walls, exposed brick, neon slogans about radical candor glowing near the espresso machine. We had meditation pods that no one used, and Slack channels dedicated to gratitude. Publicly, we celebrated collaboration. Privately, metrics were ranked. Promotions were scarce. Bonuses were opaque. My desk sat between finance and product, a physical metaphor for my role. I translated tension. I cleaned up misunderstandings. I built dashboards that quietly proved who was underperforming, but I never weaponized them. Other people did. To them, I was safe. I didn't compete for airtime in meetings. I waited. I took notes. I asked precise questions, not performative ones. When someone interrupted me, which happened more than I care to count, I'd pause, let them finish, and gently continue. Sometimes they'd notice. Often they wouldn't. There's a specific invisibility that happens when you're competent but not loud. People assume you'll always be there. They assume your patience is infinite. They assume your silence is agreement. In brainstorming sessions, my ideas were often met with polite nods. 10 minutes later, someone else would repackage the same concept with slightly sharper language and receive enthusiastic support. The first few times, I questioned myself. Maybe I hadn't articulated it well. Maybe I needed to be more assertive. Maybe I was too measured. So I adjusted, sharpened my phrasing, spoke earlier in the meeting. It didn't change much. What did change was how I started to see the room. I noticed who made eye contact only with executives, who laughed a little too loudly at the VP's jokes, who scheduled casual coffee chats the week before performance calibration meetings. I also noticed something else. The people who advanced weren't always the most capable. They were the most strategic. And strategy in my office often looked like subtle sabotage, withholding information, letting someone walk into a meeting unprepared, forwarding an email chain at just the right moment to imply incompetence. Public praise paired with private undermining. I told myself I wasn't paranoid. I was observant. Still, I stayed in my lane. I delivered early. I documented everything. I avoided gossip. When tension rose, I smoothed it. When credit was ambiguous, I stepped back. Because part of me believed that excellence would eventually speak loudly enough on its own. That belief, quiet, optimistic, almost naive, shaped who I was to them. I was dependable. I was neutral. I was the woman who would fix it without demanding applause. And in a workplace that functioned like a polished arena, I was the one competitor who didn't look like she was competing at all. At least, that's what they thought. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's how these things begin. We were preparing for a quarterly executive review, the kind where slides are rehearsed like courtroom testimony, and every number is examined for weakness. I had spent 2 weeks rebuilding our operational efficiency model because the old one hid churn risk behind averaged metrics. It looked stable on paper. It wasn't. I flagged the issue for my manager, Daniel, calmly, with data. If we present the aggregate, I told him, we'll miss the volatility in segment C. It's not visible unless you isolate it by acquisition channel. He nodded. Good catch. Add a backup slide. A backup slide. In our office, that meant we'll only show this if someone asks the exact right question. During the meeting, the director from product, Aaron, led the narrative, confident, polished. He clicked through my slides without once looking in my direction. Our churn is stabilizing quarter over quarter, he said, tapping the summary graph. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. I felt it then, a tightness behind my ribs. Not panic, not anger, something quieter. The awareness that I was watching a story being shaped in real time. And I had written the footnotes no one would read. 10 minutes in, the CFO asked, any volatility we should be aware of? There it was, a clean opening. Daniel glanced at me, just briefly, then answered himself. Nothing material. We're monitoring segment-level fluctuations, but the overall trajectory is positive. I sat still. Segment-level fluctuations. That was my work. My model, my warning. The backup slide remained hidden. After the meeting, Aaron slapped Daniel lightly on the back. Nice and tight, he said. Execs hate rabbit holes. I packed my laptop slowly. My notebook, the slim black one I carry everywhere, was open to the page where I had written 2 weeks earlier. Segment C risk increasing. Recommend disclosure. Daniel stopped by my desk later. Don't take it personally, he said, voice lowered. It just wasn't the right room to complicate the message. I nodded. That phrase echoed in my head all evening. Complicate the message. As if truth were clutter. As if clarity were optional. Objectively, nothing dramatic had happened. No one insulted me. No one raised their voice. My name wasn't erased from the slide deck. It was there, small, in the bottom corner. But something had shifted. I had done the responsible thing, identified risk, documented it, communicated it upward. And in the moment where transparency mattered, it had been softened into a footnote. The next week, when segment C dipped exactly as projected, the narrative changed subtly. We couldn't have predicted this specific channel impact, Aaron said in a follow-up sync. I stared at the screen. I had predicted it. The model timestamp proved it. The Slack messages proved it. My notebook proved it. But no one looked at me. And here's the part that unsettled me most. Everyone moved on. No confrontation, no acknowledgement, no apology. Just a quiet rewriting of the timeline. That was the first small cut. Not public humiliation, not overt sabotage. Just the realization that visibility was being managed, and I was not the one managing it. I told myself it was politics, normal, harmless, maybe even strategic. But I also wrote something new in my notebook that night. Backup slide never shown, risk minimized, narrative controlled. It wasn't anger that made me write it. It was a memory, because in an office that felt increasingly like a polished arena, where every promotion was scarce and every mistake amplified, I was beginning to understand something subtle. The loudest person in the room doesn't always control the outcome, but the person who controls the narrative often does. And for the first time, I wondered whether my silence was protecting me or positioning me to disappear. After the first small cut, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic fallout, no whispered scandal in the kitchen near the cold brew tap, no sudden shift in how people treated me, which almost made it worse, because when something subtle happens and no one names it, your brain starts negotiating against itself. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe Daniel was right, maybe it wasn't the right room, maybe protecting the narrative protected all of us. That's how normalization begins, not with acceptance, but with rationalization. A month later, it happened again. This time it was smaller, almost forgettable. We were in a cross-functional planning meeting. Marketing wanted aggressive growth targets. Finance wanted cost containment. I had built a forecast model that clearly showed we couldn't hit both without operational strain. When I began walking through the trade-offs, Aaron interrupted. "Let's not get too theoretical," he said lightly. "Can we simplify?" I paused. "This is the simplified version." A few people laughed, not at me exactly, just at the tension. Aaron leaned back in his chair. "What Nova's saying is we'll need to be careful, but I think we can stretch." What Nova's saying, not what the data shows, not what the model predicts. Just what Nova is saying, as if it were an opinion. Mood. Caution born from temperament. I felt the room subtly pivot away from my authority. It wasn't hostile. It was smoother than that. My work translated into a suggestion. His optimism reframed as leadership. Later that afternoon, one of the marketing managers stopped by my desk. "I actually agreed with you," she said quietly. "But you know how it is, we need momentum." Momentum. Another word that meant, don't be the friction. And so I adjusted again. I made my slides shorter. I front-loaded conclusions. I practiced delivering risk statements in one sentence instead of 3. It didn't change the pattern. If anything, it sharpened it. People began looping me into projects late, after decisions had been emotionally committed to. My role became validation, or containment. "Can you run the numbers and make sure this works? Just sanity check this before we show leadership. Help us tell this in a way that won't raise flags." That last one lingered. Won't raise flags. My job wasn't to eliminate risk. It was to make it palatable. And slowly, without a formal conversation, a role solidified around me. I was the adult in the room, the stabilizer, the one who cleaned up after ambitious promises, the one who absorbed tension without reflecting it back. It sounds noble when phrased that way. It didn't feel noble. It felt extractive. I noticed something else too. When I spoke with conviction, when I didn't soften my language, I was described differently in feedback cycles. Nova can be intense, very detail-oriented, sometimes to a fault. Needs to align more with executive messaging. Intensity, detail-oriented to a fault, in a company that claimed to value data-driven decisions. The contradictions were almost elegant. I started anticipating dismissal before it happened, editing myself mid-sentence, adding disclaimers. "This might be wrong, but just a thought. We can ignore this if it's not helpful." Each qualifier shaved off authority, and no one told me to do it. That's the insidious part. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it's repetition. A pattern so consistent that you begin participating in it. By the end of that quarter, I realized something uncomfortable. No one saw me as a threat. In an office that operated like a quiet battle royale, that might sound like safety. It wasn't. Because in environments where people sabotage each other to rise, being non-threatening doesn't make you immune. It makes you useful, and useful people are often the easiest to overlook when credit is distributed or blame is assigned. Still, I stayed. I told myself stability mattered, that patience was a strength, that integrity would outlast politics. But a question had begun forming beneath the surface. If I kept shrinking to fit the role they preferred, at what point would there be nothing left of me to expand again? There's a moment, subtle, almost administrative, when you realize you've been cast. Not promoted, not demoted, cast. It happened during a leadership offsite I wasn't technically invited to, but was asked to support, which meant I would build the decks, run the numbers, coordinate logistics, and remain invisible once the real conversations began. The venue was a glass-walled co-working retreat an hour outside the city. Exposed beams, catered lunch, inspirational quotes on reclaimed wood panels. I arrived early with 2 laptops and a printed run of show schedule. By the time the executives trickled in, everything was set. Slides preloaded, breakout worksheets organized, financial scenarios color-coded. Daniel smiled when he saw me. "Don't know what we'd do without you." It was meant as appreciation. but I noticed something in the phrasing. Not "you should be in there with us," not "make sure you contribute," just gratitude for my reliability. When the first session began, I sat at the back near the power outlet, as planned. Aaron stood at the front, presenting a 3-year growth vision heavily dependent on operational efficiency gains I had modeled. As he spoke, I watched the room react. Nods, notes, the kind of engaged silence that signals alignment. No one asked where the assumptions came from. No one questioned the contingency plans I had outlined in the appendix, because I wasn't presenting them. Midway through the afternoon, a debate broke out between product and finance about headcount allocation. Voices remained polite, but the undercurrent sharpened. "Operations can absorb some of this," Aaron said casually. "Nova's team is lean, but efficient. My team, there was no team. It was me, and one junior analyst on a contract set to expire." I cleared my throat gently. Based on current workload capacity, we'd likely see delays in reporting cycles if we absorb additional scope without headcount. Aaron turned slightly, smiling in a way that felt reassuring to everyone but me. "That's why we hire adaptable people." Laughter, light, agreeable. And just like that, the room moved forward. In that moment, the role crystallized. I was the dependable engine, the one expected to stretch quietly, the one whose boundaries were elastic, the one who would make ambitious projections feasible through personal endurance. Reliable, useful, invisible. Later, during a coffee break, one of the VPs approached me. "You're so calm," she said. "I don't know how you stay out of the politics." Stay out of, as if politics were weather, as if opting out were protection. What she didn't see was that staying out wasn't immunity, it was exclusion. When promotion conversations happened, I wasn't framed as strategic. I was framed as steady, as execution-focused, as critical support. Support doesn't ascend, it sustains. That evening, after the offsite ended, I stayed behind to pack up the equipment. The room was quiet, sunlight fading against the glass. I sat alone at the long wooden table where, hours earlier, decisions about the company's future had been made. I opened my notebook, assigned additional scope without headcount. Narrative adaptable, role, absorb impact. I didn't write it angrily. I wrote it clearly because I understood something new. Roles, once accepted, become expectations. Expectation becomes identity. Identity becomes a limitation. No one had maliciously designed this for me. There was no secret meeting where they decided I should remain small. It was more efficient than that. They observed what I tolerated. They rewarded what made their lives easier. They repeated it. And I complied, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed competence would eventually translate into authority. Sitting in that empty retreat space, I finally allowed myself to admit a harder truth. In an environment that rewards visibility over substance, being the engine means you power the machine, but you never get to steer it. And for the first time, I questioned whether I wanted to keep fueling something that would never acknowledge the cost. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no dramatic email, no public slight so blatant it forced a response. It happened on a Tuesday morning, quiet, ordinary. I was early, like always. The office was half-lit, and city fog still pressed against the glass walls. I liked those first 40 minutes before Slack notifications began pulsing, before the strategy turned into theater. I was reviewing performance metrics from the previous quarter, headcount utilization, output velocity, and error rates. Numbers don't gossip, they don't posture, they just reveal patterns. And there it was, a pattern I hadn't seen clearly before because I'd been too close to it. Every time a cross-functional initiative succeeded, the executive summary credited collaborative leadership alignment. Every time it underperformed, operational constraints were highlighted. Operational constraints. That was me, not by name, never by name, but the narrative arc was consistent. Ambition lived in product and marketing, friction lived in operations. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle, not spike, inside my chest. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. I opened my notebook and began mapping timelines. Project launch dates, staffing decisions, forecast warnings, executive summaries, public praise, private Slack threads. The more I laid it out chronologically, the more obvious it became. I wasn't being overlooked randomly. I was structurally positioned. My balance had been interpreted as consent. My reliability had been interpreted as capacity. My restraint had been interpreted as a lack of ambition. And because I never corrected the interpretation, it calcified. Around 9:15 a.m., Aaron walked by my desk. "Morning, Nova, quick thing. Can you tighten the Q2 variance explanation? Make it less heavy?" Less heavy. I looked up at him, and for the first time, didn't immediately respond with, "Of course." I paused. "Less heavy in what way?" I asked evenly. He hesitated, just slightly. "You know, more forward-looking, less focused on constraints." "Constraints. Reality." I nodded once. "I'll revise the framing." He smiled, satisfied, and walked away. But I didn't open the slide deck. Instead, I watched the office wake up around me. Laughter near the espresso machine. A heated whisper about headcount freezes. A congratulatory email for a director who had championed operational efficiency improvements. I had built those improvements, and suddenly the emotional equation changed. Up until that morning, I had been trying to prove my value inside a system that benefited from undervaluing me. That realization didn't make me want to explode. It made me want to recalibrate. I thought about my early career, the first job where I'd spoken up bluntly and been labeled difficult. I thought about how carefully I'd trained myself since then, how I'd learned to be precise but non-threatening, honest but not disruptive. I had optimized for safety, but safety in this office was a ceiling. And here was the quietest part of the shift. I stopped wanting their approval, not in a rebellious way, not in a dramatic "I don't care anymore" way, just in a detached, analytical way. If the system rewarded narrative control over operational truth, then competing through excellence alone was naive. I didn't need to be louder. I needed to be smarter. I closed my notebook and finally opened the Q2 slide deck. I rewrote the variance explanation. Not softer, but sharper. Forward-looking, yes, but anchored in documented decisions, approved trade-offs, and time-stamped assumptions. No emotion, no accusation, just clarity that couldn't be reframed without effort. When Daniel reviewed it later, he frowned slightly. "This is detailed." "It's accurate," I said calmly. He studied me for a moment, as if sensing something different but unable to name it. "All right," he replied, "let's try it." That Tuesday morning, nothing dramatic changed on the surface. But internally, something irreversible had begun. I was no longer participating unconsciously in the role they'd assigned me. Silence from that day forward would no longer be instinct. It would be a choice, and choice is where power begins to shift. After that Tuesday, I didn't become louder. I became deliberate. There's a difference. Before, my silence came from caution, from a desire not to escalate, from the quiet hope that if I just performed exceptionally well, the room would eventually recalibrate around me. Now my silence had edges. In meetings, I began speaking less, but later. Instead of jumping in to clarify misunderstandings, I let conversations unfold. I listened to who committed to what. I noted exact phrasing. Operations confirmed this is feasible. We're aligned on capacity. Nova's team can absorb that. I didn't interrupt immediately. I let the sentence land. Then I'd ask calmly, "Can you clarify what specific capacity you're referencing?" The effect was subtle but noticeable. It forced precision. It shifted vague optimism into measurable commitment. Some people adjusted quickly. Others bristled. Aaron especially began watching me more carefully in meetings. Not confrontationally, just alert. One afternoon during a roadmap sync, he outlined an accelerated launch timeline that compressed testing cycles by 2 weeks. "Operations will streamline validation," he said confidently. I waited until the room was quiet. "Streamline by removing which safeguards?" I asked. Silence. Not dramatic, just long enough to be uncomfortable. "We'll figure that out," he replied. I nodded once. "Okay. For the record, the current validation time exists to prevent revenue-impacting defects. If we remove it, we should document acceptance of that risk." The phrase hung in the air. Document acceptance of risk. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even resistance. It was accountability. And that's when I saw it. The flicker. Not fear, not anger. Awareness. Because in a workplace that functioned like a polished arena, strategy often depended on ambiguity, on enthusiasm moving faster than documentation. I wasn't blocking momentum. I was slowing narrative drift. Outside of meetings, I changed something else. I stopped volunteering to fix problems I hadn't created. When a last-minute data issue surfaced before a leadership review, Daniel messaged me at 8:47 p.m. "Any chance you can jump on this tonight?" Before, I would have opened my laptop instantly. This time I responded 15 minutes later. "I can address this first thing in the morning. Current analysis window is closed for the day." No apology. No explanation. Just boundary. He didn't push. But the next morning he asked, "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm prioritizing sustainable pacing." He looked confused, as if sustainability were a foreign concept. Here's what changed internally. I stopped trying to prove indispensability, because indispensability without authority is a trap. If you're the only one who can fix things, you're also the one who absorbs every failure. So I began documenting shared ownership more explicitly. When someone requested analysis, I'd respond in writing, confirming that this request originated from X decision discussed on Y date. Neutral, factual. Patterns started emerging. Projects that once flowed loosely now required clearer sign-offs. Conversations that relied on assumed compliance had to adapt to recorded clarity. Some colleagues appreciated it. One of the finance managers told me quietly, "It's good you're tightening things. It's been messy." Others interpreted it differently. Nova's gotten rigid, I overheard near the kitchen. Rigid, because I was no longer cushioning their overreach. The interesting part? No one confronted me directly, because technically, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was performing my role, just without absorbing invisible labor. And that's when I understood something critical. In environments where people sabotage each other quietly to rise, the most disruptive act isn't aggression. It's transparency. My silence no longer meant compliance. It meant I was observing who adapted and who depended on my invisibility. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic began to shift. Not because I attacked, but because I stopped protecting narratives that harmed me. Once silence became a choice, preparation became instinct, not paranoia, not revenge. Preparation. In an office that functioned like a battle royale, disguised as collaboration, most people trained outward. They networked up. They positioned laterally. They protected visibility. I trained inward. I began treating the company like a case study. Every major initiative from the past 2 years, I mapped it. Who proposed it? Who approved it? Who resourced it? Who was credited when it succeeded? Who was named when it faltered? Patterns hardened into evidence. Marketing-led risks were framed as bold experiments. Product-led miscalculations were framed as iteration cycles. Operational constraints were framed as drag. And yet, when projects stabilized, efficiency metrics were spotlighted. Metrics built on my frameworks. I wasn't angry as I compiled this. I was focused. My black leather notebook evolved into a parallel archive. But I also created something else. A private digital tracker, time-stamped and stored outside shared drives. Meeting summaries, Slack excerpts, performance feedback phrases, budget approvals, headcount denials. Not to weaponize, to understand leverage. Because leverage isn't about secrets. It's about clarity that others don't realize you hold. I also started investing in relationships differently, not socially, strategically. I scheduled one-on-ones with teams outside my reporting line. Compliance, legal, HR, analytics, not gossip sessions, context sessions. How are risk assessments documented formally? What triggers audit review? How are performance calibration narratives constructed? Most people love explaining systems when you ask respectfully. And slowly I saw the architecture beneath the culture. Promotions weren't just about performance. They were about sponsorship. And sponsorship depended on narrative consistency. If you were framed early as visionary, later mistakes were anomalies. If you were framed early as operational support, later excellence was an expectation. That realization didn't depress me. It clarified the game. Meanwhile, something subtle began happening around me. Because I was documenting boundaries more clearly, fewer last-minute fires landed solely on my desk. Instead, I'd respond, looping in stakeholders who approved scope expansion. That simple phrase redistributed heat. At first, people tried to reroute around me, Slack threads without me, quick side meetings. But that created a different problem for them. When decisions weren't documented properly, downstream confusion increased. Forecast errors widened. Timelines slipped. And because I had stopped automatically absorbing the fallout, inconsistencies became visible. One afternoon, the CFO requested a deep dive review into cross-functional execution gaps. Not dramatic, just procedural. I wasn't surprised. I had been tracking the same gaps for months. What they never noticed was that I wasn't just observing dysfunction. I was becoming fluent in governance. I read policy documents that most people ignored. I studied how risk disclosures were phrased in board updates. I learned which language triggered scrutiny and which diffused it. Words like anticipated variance versus unmitigated exposure. Language shapes consequence, and I was done letting others shape it unopposed. There was one more shift, quieter, more personal. I stopped tying my identity to being indispensable. After work, I updated my resume, not because I planned to leave immediately, but I needed to see my own trajectory independent of their framing. When I wrote it objectively, the pattern was undeniable. System stabilization, forecast accuracy improvements, cost leakage reduction, process redesign. I wasn't supported. I was structural. The next time Aaron casually referenced operational flexibility in a meeting, I didn't flinch. I simply noted the phrasing. Because what he and others never noticed was this. While they competed for visible territory, I was studying the foundation. And foundations, when examined closely enough, reveal where weight is unevenly distributed. I wasn't preparing to explode the system. I was preparing to understand exactly where it would crack under pressure, quietly, methodically, without announcing that I had seen through it. The leverage didn't arrive like a revelation. It assembled itself, piece by piece, pattern by pattern, document by document. And then one afternoon, sitting alone in a small conference room with the blinds half drawn, I saw it clearly. The company wasn't just culturally misaligned. It was structurally exposed. The exposure centered around something no one talked about openly: risk representation to the board. Every quarter, a distilled narrative traveled upward, compressed, curated, strategically phrased. Operational volatility was summarized. Product risk was contextualized. Financial strain was smoothed into forward-looking optimism. On paper, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. But the delta between internal documentation and executive summary language was widening, and I was uniquely positioned at that intersection. Because I built the operational forecasts, because I received the late-night Slack messages when the scope shifted, because I documented headcount refusals tied to timeline accelerations, because I tracked when risk disclosures were softened. One Friday, I was asked to prepare supporting data for the upcoming board pre-read. Just the standard capacity metrics, Daniel said. Keep it clean. Keep it clean. I pulled the historical data sets. Then, out of curiosity and something sharper, I overlaid 3 timelines: approved headcount reductions, accelerated product commitments, executive summaries describing efficiency gains. The correlation wasn't subtle. Efficiency gains weren't coming from innovation. They were coming from suppressed reporting cycles and deferred validation steps, which meant short-term margin improvements were being achieved by compressing operational safeguards. That alone wasn't scandalous. What made it leverage was this. The board materials described these gains as sustainable. They weren't. They were elastic strain. And I had documentation, time-stamped, approved, acknowledged, that showed the trade-offs had been flagged internally. No one had lied outright, but language had drifted, and in governance, drift matters. I didn't celebrate when I realized this. I felt very still, because leverage isn't power unless you understand its cost. If I surfaced the discrepancy aggressively, it would trigger defensiveness, escalation, possibly retaliation. If I ignored it, I remained complicit in narrative smoothing. There was a third option: clarity without accusation. I opened the draft board appendix and revised one section. Not dramatically. I added a single slide titled Operational Capacity Sensitivity Analysis. No red flags, no dramatic language. Just 3 scenarios: in current staffing with an accelerated roadmap, reduced staffing with a sustained roadmap, reduced staffing with an accelerated roadmap. The third scenario showed margin gains, followed by delayed defect detection and revenue exposure in subsequent quarters, all sourced from existing internal models. I included footnotes referencing documented scope approvals and headcount decisions. No commentary, just math. When I sent the draft to Daniel, I wrote, adding capacity sensitivity view for completeness and governance alignment. Governance alignment, language he respected. He called me 10 minutes later. This is thorough, he said. Yes, I replied calmly. It aligns operational inputs with financial outputs across scenarios. A pause. Do we need this level of detail for the board? He asked. I didn't argue. I believe it reduces future narrative risk. Another pause. That phrase landed, future narrative risk, because suddenly the conversation wasn't about complicating the message. It was about protecting it. He didn't remove the slide. He didn't praise it either. He forwarded it upward. That was the private reveal. Not a confrontation, not a takedown. Just the quiet realization that I held something most people underestimated: continuity of truth. In an environment where ambition moved faster than documentation, I had both the memory and the evidence. And more importantly, I understood the system well enough to introduce clarity without appearing combative. There was no celebration that night, no triumphant feeling, just a sober awareness. I was no longer invisible. I was calibrated. And once you understand exactly where the structural tension lives, you can choose when and whether to let others feel it. Leverage doesn't force a move. It offers one. After the capacity sensitivity slide circulated, something subtle shifted in tone across leadership threads. Language became slightly more cautious. Phrases like validated assumptions and documented trade-offs appeared more often. No one referenced me directly, but I could feel the system recalibrating around the presence of recorded clarity. And that's when the real decision surfaced, because now I had options. Option 1, stay. Continue operating with elevated precision. Gradually reshape narrative culture from within. Build sponsorship quietly. Compete strategically instead of passively. Option 2. Escalate. Request a formal conversation about structural misrepresentation. Position myself as governance-aligned leadership. Risk of being labeled political. Option 3. Detach. Not emotionally, structurally. Leverage clarity to redesign my trajectory outside the machine. The third option was the most irreversible and the most peaceful. The tipping point came during mid-year performance calibration. I wasn't in the room, you heart. Of course not, I never was, but afterward, Daniel scheduled our one-on-one. He used the same tone he always did. Professional, measured. Strong execution as always, he began. You're a critical pillar for cross-functional stability. Pillar, load-bearing, stationary. We'd like to see more executive presence from you next cycle, he continued. More proactive alignment with strategic vision. Strategic vision, the same vision that had depended on my suppressed safeguards to appear efficient. I listened without interrupting. And promotion? I asked evenly. He hesitated, just slightly. You're on the radar, but timing is complex this year. Timing. It was almost elegant how the language never changed. Not denied. Not advanced. Deferred. As I walked back to my desk, something settled with finality. I could stay and fight for reframing. I could escalate and risk internal resistance. Or I could accept what the system had already shown me. It would extract indefinitely if I allowed it. That evening, instead of updating documentation, I opened my personal email. Weeks earlier, after updating my resume, I had quietly taken 2 exploratory interviews. One with a governance consulting firm. One with a mid-sized company rebuilding operational infrastructure after a failed expansion. I hadn't taken them seriously at first, just calibration. Now I revisited the notes. Both roles emphasized something my current company minimized: structural integrity, long-term modeling, risk transparency. Not as footnotes, as a strategy. The next morning, I requested a follow-up conversation with the consulting firm. No announcement, no emotional resignation, no dramatic exit fantasy, just movement. Over the next month, I progressed through interviews quietly, case studies, scenario modeling, governance philosophy discussions. Ironically, the examples I used to demonstrate insight were drawn directly from the environment I had navigated, anonymized, reframed, and structured. They saw strategic thinking, where my current company saw execution support. The offer came on a Thursday afternoon. Title: Director of Operational Governance. Scope: Cross-company risk architecture. Compensation: 28% increase. Reporting line: direct to CFO. I read the letter twice. The irreversible decision wasn't accepting it. It was recognizing that I no longer needed validation from a system that misunderstood my value. I signed the offer that night. No fireworks, no anger, just alignment. The next step would require precision, timing, documentation, and transition planning. But internally, the choice was already complete. I wasn't going to explode the machine. I was going to step out of it. And once I did, the structural strain I had quietly been absorbing would redistribute. Not because I exposed anyone, but because I stopped holding the weight. Once I signed the offer, everything became about timing. Not revenge timing, structural timing. My new role required a 6-week transition. My current company requires 4 weeks' notice for senior analysts. I gave them 5. Not out of generosity, out of calibration. I scheduled the resignation meeting with Daniel for a Tuesday morning. Neutral ground in the week. Not a Friday shockwave. Not a Monday disruption. When I sat down in his glass office, I placed a single printed letter on the table. I've accepted another opportunity, I said evenly. My final day will be 5 weeks from now. He blinked once. There it was. The first genuine disruption I had caused in years. Oh, he said, recovering quickly. Is this about promotion timing? We can revisit. It's aligned with long-term growth, I replied calmly. Aligned, not emotional, not reactive. Strategic. He asked where I was going. I told him the title, not the company name yet. Director of Operational Governance. I watched the words register. Director. Governance. The very language I had been quietly introducing into our documentation. That's significant, he admitted. Yes, I said simply. There was no negotiation, no counteroffer, just a request for transition planning. And that's when the silent part began. Over the next 5 weeks, I didn't disengage. I documented. Every active project received a detailed handoff file. Assumptions, risks, decision history, and pending exposure. Not bare minimum, comprehensive. I scheduled knowledge transfer sessions and recorded them. Shared access rights, mapped dependencies. Outwardly, I was the model of professionalism. Internally, I was releasing weight. What no one noticed at first was what I stopped doing. I stopped absorbing ambiguity. When Aaron attempted to accelerate a roadmap milestone during my notice period, I responded, "With my departure scheduled, I recommend revisiting timeline feasibility with remaining capacity owners." Capacity owners, plural, responsibility redistributed. He frowned slightly but didn't push, because now pushing meant documented ownership without the quiet buffer I had always provided. Meanwhile, something else unfolded beneath the surface. The board pre-read from the previous quarter, including the capacity sensitivity slide, had triggered follow-up inquiries. Nothing dramatic, just requests for deeper scenario planning. Without announcing it, I had already shifted governance tone before my exit. And here's the key. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't send anonymous emails. I didn't escalate to HR. I didn't circulate private documentation. I simply ensured accuracy outlived me. During my final week, Daniel asked if I'd consider staying longer to stabilize transition. I declined gently. "I've built sustainable documentation," I said. "The system should function without a single point of failure." It was the most honest sentence I had ever spoken in that office. On my last day, there was cake in the kitchen, a Slack thread filled with polite praise. "Nova kept us sane. Operations wouldn't run without her. Wishing you the best." Kind words, but underneath them, I sensed something else. Uncertainty, because for years, I had been the invisible tension absorber in a workplace that quietly rewarded competitive sabotage. And now that absorption layer was gone. I packed my notebook into my bag, the slim black one filled with dates and observations. Not as evidence, as memory. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light, not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had moved without noise. And in environments like that, silence paired with structure is the most destabilizing force of all. For the first 2 weeks after I left, nothing dramatic happened, at least nothing public. I started my new role immersed in governance frameworks and cross-company risk mapping. Different environment, different tone, fewer beanbags, more whiteboards filled with scenario trees. But old habits linger. I still checked my former company's public Slack announcements occasionally. Product launches, hiring updates, carefully worded optimism. Then slowly, small fractures surfaced. It began with a message from a former colleague in finance. "Quick question," she wrote casually. "Do you remember how you used to model cross-functional capacity offsets? We're trying to reconcile something." "Used to. Trying to reconcile something." I replied politely but briefly. I pointed her to shared documentation folders. Everything should be in the Q3 transition archive. 3 days later, another message. This time from the junior analyst who had once worked under me. "Are you available for a quick call? The defect backlog spiked, and we're not sure how it ties to roadmap compression assumptions." I read the message twice. Defect backlog. Roadmap compression. The exact sensitivity I had mapped months earlier. "I can't consult formally," I replied. "But the capacity sensitivity model explains downstream impact timing." There was a long pause before he responded. "Yeah, we found it." Found it, as if it had been buried treasure instead of an attached slide. Over the next month, public language from the company shifted subtly. Quarterly updates referenced unexpected operational strain. Timeline revisions were framed as strategic recalibration. Translation: elastic strain had snapped back. What interested me wasn't the strain itself. It was who felt it. Aaron's team began missing aggressive targets. Without my documented pushback, optimism traveled faster internally, until reality caught up externally. Daniel's updates grew more cautious, more hedged. Words like complexity and resource interdependency appeared frequently. The absorption layer was gone. And here's the part that mattered most. No one blamed me. They couldn't. My documentation was clean. My handoffs were comprehensive. My warnings had been time-stamped and acknowledged long before departure. The system wasn't collapsing. It was revealing its true weight distribution. A former marketing manager called me one evening. "I don't think we realized how much you were buffering," she admitted quietly. "Things feel louder now." Louder, because when invisible stabilization disappears, friction becomes audible. Meetings ran longer. Slack debates intensified. Last-minute escalations increased, not because people became worse, but because the illusion of seamless alignment had depended on someone quietly absorbing misalignment. Meanwhile, at my new company, I presented a governance review to the CFO during my 3rd week. Clear trade-offs, scenario impacts, documented risk acceptance pathways. Afterward, he said something simple. "This is the kind of clarity we've been missing." Clarity, not optimism, not momentum. Clarity. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned. Back at my former company, the board requested deeper operational audits. Nothing scandalous, just scrutiny. Scrutiny changes behavior. Language tightened. Assumptions required footnotes. Accelerated timelines demanded written risk acceptance. The very structures I had gently introduced before leaving were now becoming standard practice, out of necessity. And here's the quietest consequence of all. The culture didn't implode. It adjusted. Because systems built on subtle sabotage can survive tension. What they struggle with is transparency. And transparency, once introduced, is hard to reverse. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped carrying what wasn't mine. And once the weight was redistributed, everyone could finally feel what had always been there. About 3 months after I left, Daniel called me. Not a text, not a Slack message. A call. I let it ring once before answering. "Hey Nova," he began, voice careful. "I wanted to run something by you." I leaned back in my chair in my new office, solid door, no glass walls, and waited. "There's been some board-level concern around operational forecasting alignment," he said. "They're asking when the internal sensitivity models were first developed." I knew exactly which models. "They were introduced in Q2, I replied evenly. "Documented in the board appendix." A pause. "Yes," he said. "We see that now. We see that now." The words carried more weight than he probably intended. Because the models hadn't been hidden. They had simply been inconvenient. "They're questioning why roadmap compression continued after risk documentation," he continued. I didn't answer immediately. Not to be dramatic. To be precise. "Risk documentation doesn't prevent decisions," I said calmly. "It clarifies accountability." Silence on the other end. I could almost picture the recalibration happening in real time. "I guess we assumed we had more elasticity," he admitted quietly. Elasticity. That word again. The assumption that systems and people can stretch indefinitely without structural consequence. "I hope things stabilize," I said, and I meant it. After we hung up, I sat still for a moment. There was no satisfaction in the call, just confirmation. It was too late to fix certain things quietly. Once the board began tracing timelines, once documentation met outcome, narratives hardened into records. No one was being fired. No scandal was breaking. This wasn't corporate drama. It was slower than that. Trust was tightening. And trust, once thinned, doesn't snap loudly. It constricts. Former colleagues began reaching out more frequently. "Do you still have that original capacity baseline? Was the defect detection lag always projected at 6 weeks? Do you remember who approved the Q3 scope expansion?" Each question carried the same undertone. "We're trying to reconstruct something we didn't take seriously when you were here. But reconstruction after strain isn't the same as prevention before it." In my absence, some dynamics had intensified. Without a stabilizing presence documenting trade-offs in real time, optimism and pressure had collided more directly. Teams that once relied on my neutral translations were now confronting each other without a buffer. Meetings reportedly grew sharper, not shouting, that was never the culture, but clipped, defensive. And here's the most telling part. They attempted to hire a replacement with a nearly identical job description to mine. But they framed it differently. Director of Operational Risk and Strategy. Not an analyst. Director. Risk and Strategy. The very reframing I had outgrown. When I saw the posting forwarded to me by a former colleague, I didn't feel resentment. I felt clarity. They hadn't misunderstood my value entirely. They had misunderstood its timing. Back in my new role, I was leading a cross-functional review on expansion pacing. One executive suggested accelerating despite early strain signals. I asked one question. "What documented risk are we formally accepting if we do that?" The room went quiet. Then the CFO nodded slowly. "Let's map that before committing. No friction, no defensiveness. Just process." That's when it settled fully. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was culture. At my former company, governance had been an afterthought to momentum. By the time they tried to correct it, momentum had already outpaced structure. Too late to fix it quietly, not catastrophic, just exposed. And exposure changes how people move. Not because someone exploded, but because someone stopped absorbing what wasn't sustainable. The final conversation wasn't planned. It happened 6 months after I left, at an industry conference in Chicago. Neutral territory, carpeted hallways, name badges, polished panel discussions about scalable growth in volatile markets. I had just stepped off a breakout stage where I spoke about governance architecture when I heard my name. "Nova." I turned. "Aaron." Same confident posture, same measured smile, slightly more tension around the eyes. We stood facing each other beneath a banner about sustainable innovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Congratulations on the new role," he said. "I've been hearing your name in interesting contexts." "Interesting contexts," I nodded. "Thank you. I've been following your expansion updates." He exhaled lightly, not quite a laugh. "It's been a learning curve." There it was. No accusation, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. We found a quiet corner near the coffee station. People passed by, but no one lingered. "I'll be direct," he said. "When you left, we underestimated the structural gap." I didn't interrupt. "You were holding more threads than we realized," he continued. "Not just data, translation." Translation? I had never used that word myself, but it fit. "Systems should function without a single point of failure," I replied evenly. "If they don't, that's not the analyst's fault." He studied me for a moment. "Do you think we were reckless?" he asked. It wasn't a trap. It sounded genuine. "I think momentum outpaced documentation," I said calmly. "And documentation is what protects momentum long term. No edge, no heat, just truth without sharpness." He nodded slowly. "We're restructuring, building formal risk checkpoints. It's not as fast as before." "Speed without sustainability creates drag later," I replied. A faint smile crossed his face. "You always said things like that. I guess we didn't always listen." There was no apology. And I didn't need one, because the confrontation wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. "You weren't wrong to push growth," I added. "But growth requires visible trade-offs. Invisible ones compound." He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You could have escalated harder," he said. Not accusatory, reflective. "I chose documentation over escalation," I replied. "It lasts longer." Silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, just complete. Finally, he extended his hand. "Well," he said, "you were right about elasticity." I shook his hand once. This was never about being right. And it wasn't. As we parted, I felt no surge of triumph, no replay of past frustrations. Just equilibrium, because confrontation without heat isn't about dominance. It's about closure. He had seen the structure too late. I had seen it early enough to step out. And sometimes, the most powerful reversal isn't proving someone wrong. It's allowing reality to educate them, without you needing to raise your voice. If you had met me a year ago, you would have described me as dependable. If you met me now, you might still use that word. But it would mean something different. I no longer confuse reliability with self-erasure. In my current role, I sit at tables I used to orbit. Not because I became louder, not because I sharpened my elbows, because I stopped negotiating my value inside systems that benefited from minimizing it. Director of Operational Governance sounds impressive on paper, but titles aren't what changed me. Clarity did. In my new company, risk conversations happen early. Documentation isn't treated as friction, it's treated as infrastructure. When I raise a concern, it's not interpreted as negativity. It's integrated into planning. The first time a senior executive said, "Nova, what are we not seeing yet?" I paused internally, not because I didn't have an answer, because no one had ever asked me that question in that tone before. It wasn't defensive, it was invitational, and I realized something quietly powerful. I had never lacked executive presence. I had lacked executive audience. There's a difference. In my old office, the one with free snacks and beanbags, masking competitive undercurrents, I adapted to survive. I optimized for safety. I translated tension. I absorbed impact. Now I design systems so absorption isn't required. I build visible trade-offs into decision frameworks. I insist on documented risk acceptance before acceleration. I train teams to distinguish optimism from assumption, not as control, as protection. Personally, I've changed too. I speak earlier when necessary, not to dominate, to anchor. I say no without apology when timelines ignore capacity. I mentor younger analysts differently from how I was mentored. I tell them competence is powerful, but narrative awareness is survival. I teach them to document patterns, not just tasks. Most importantly, I no longer shrink from preserving comfort. If a room misinterprets clarity as intensity, I don't immediately soften. I assess whether the room deserves adjustment. There's a steadiness in me now that isn't defensive. It's structural. And here's what surprises people when I say it. I don't resent my former company. It taught me pattern recognition. It taught me how culture shapes consequences. It showed me how subtle sabotage thrives in ambiguity. But it also revealed my threshold. I learned that silence is only powerful when chosen, not when conditioned. I learned that being indispensable without authority is a quiet trap. I learned that quiet dominance isn't about overpowering anyone. It's about understanding weight distribution. In rooms, in systems, in yourself. Who am I now? I'm still observant, still analytical, still measured, but I am no longer invisible by default. I am intentional, and intention changes everything. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it isn't that you should leave at the first sign of politics. It's this: pay attention to where the weight keeps landing. In my old office, the one that looked progressive and playful on the surface, but functioned like a quiet battle royale underneath, the competition wasn't loud. No one slammed doors. No one openly sabotaged with cartoon villain energy. It was softer than that. Credit drifted. Risk was reframed. Optimism outran documentation. And the most reliable person became the shock absorber. For a long time, that person was me. Not because I was weak, because I was capable. And capable people are often trusted with silent strain. The danger isn't in being competent. The danger is in believing competence alone will protect you. What protects you is awareness. Awareness of narrative. Awareness of patterns. Awareness of how culture distributes consequences. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't win by shouting in a conference room. I won by choosing where I would no longer stand. By documenting instead of arguing. By setting boundaries instead of absorbing. By stepping out instead of imploding the system from within. And here's the quiet truth. Once I stopped carrying what wasn't mine, the structure revealed itself. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just honestly. If you're in a workplace right now that smiles publicly but strains privately, if you're the one people call solid while quietly stacking more responsibility onto your plate, I want you to ask yourself something gentle but important. Are you choosing your silence? Or were you trained into it? Because there is power in restraint, but there is even more power in deciding when restraint no longer serves you. I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that the culture everyone praised was quietly costing you something? And if so, what did you do when you finally saw it clearly?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.